I always enjoy going up and down to Scotland, but one of the big things whenever I go up or down for the next like 2 or 3 weeks, but actually no, 2 or 3 months I should say. Facebook constantly bombards me with articles from different Scottish newspapers. This can be sometimes very good because you do get quite a lot of interesting articles from like the Scottish point of view, which you're going to go through today. This is what's from the Herald, and I completely agree. We have really recently seen a massive turn towards this idea of getting rid of, quote, cheap labour. And it's not the business's fault for trying to use this and exploit cheap labour. Again, if the Tories were serious about getting rid and stopping exploitation of cheap labour, they would stop 0-hour contracts. That is the most exploitative thing we currently see in our system, and something should be done absolutely post-haste about it. But we aren't going to see anything like that from this government, because this is part of, I think, increasingly becoming the Tories' grand plan for the UK, for Britain. They want to completely destroy workers' rights. This is why workers' rights was not put in the political declaration. This is why Boris Johnson decided to tear it up. We are going to be in a massive situation sooner or later where we are going to see a lot of rights that we have taken for granted for quite some time are suddenly just going to disappear overnight. And that is quite a scary thought, because this is once again what we told people these people will do. It's becoming very clear day by day that my two scenarios of either Boris Johnson is just playing to his crowd, his hardball crowd, and he's going to do a deal anyway, regardless. He just wants to play the strong man, or in July, he is actually going to be an absolute colossal idiot and just say, okay, we're going to have a no-deal Brexit. And I'm not calling it an Australian style deal, because that's just complete bogus. It's just complete PR from the Tories, who have rebranded a no-deal Brexit to a WTO Brexit, and now they want to an Australia style deal, which means nothing. It's just a name, a fancy name attached to something we already know. It's a no-deal Brexit, so we ain't calling it that. But this comes from, as I say, the article from the Scottish Herald. So the Conservative cheap labour slogan is Brexit fantasy in days of dangerous populism. Sadly, in these days of dangerous populism, we have a UK government which seems in favour of sloganeering over constructive action. We've covered this before, and I've said this before. Slogan, just throwing slogans out there means nothing. It's policy that really matters. And they can say everything they want about getting rid of cheap labour, but until they actually implement policy to actually affect it, that's not going to happen. So, astonishingly, it is not only the acolytes of Boris Johnson and co. who lap up his rhetoric at face value. Many sections of the media do too. Last week, when we had the well-trained announcement of a move to an Australian-style points-based system of immigration in the wake of Brexit, this is entirely in keeping with the Conservatives' pledge to bear down on immigration, which is sadly what Brexit seems to be about for so many people, including some cabinet members, of course, when all the facade is stripped away. Mr Johnson and his former advisor Dominic Cummings have shown themselves to be masters of glib phrases which whip up the masses and give fuel to the British nationalist fever. So, in keeping with the Conservative style, it was no surprise to hear the immigration move described by Home Secretary Priti Patel as a way to stop the flow of cheap, low-skilled labour. What was lamentable about this, apart from the obvious mental mischaracterization of the issue, was that many of the media outlets reported as a fact the message coming from Ms Patel and the Conservatives that their immigration policy would end cheap labour, without any apparent critical thinking. It was not, in some places, reported as a claim. There were no quotation marks around this phrase of intolerance of cheap labour. Sorry, but the saga brought back memories of how uncritically the Get Brexit Done slogan from Messrs Johnson and Cummings were accepted in the run-up to the general election. Of course, Mr Johnson got his technical Brexit on January 31st. However, the impression given that getting Brexit done on January the 31st would be the end of the matter could not be further from the truth. The bulk of the dismal effects on the economy and society have yet to be felt, and people need to be aware of this. Major economic damage of leaving the European single market, projected by the Tories in their own forecasts, will unfold after the end of the transitional period, over years and decades to come. Perhaps after the Conservatives are done pointing the finger at immigrants, who it should be noted provide a major boost to the economy and society in contrast to the Tory Brexiteer messaging. This UK government will find someone else to blame, probably the European Union again. After all, the Tories succeeded in persuading those whose lives had been blighted for years by the Conservative austerity that it was the EU which was to blame. The actual story of immigration in the UK has in stark contrast to the Tory fantasy, not been one of cheap labour. Free movement of people with the European single market has been hugely beneficial to Scotland and the UK as a whole. There seems to be a lack of understanding, no doubt a willful one in many cases, of the reality of the UK benefits greatly from the contribution of immigrants in all sorts of jobs. A tight labour market has seen many immigrants take on labour-intensive jobs which some people in the UK seem to have reluctant to do, and for which there have been huge shortages of workers. Those who have moved here from other EU countries have done so to work in all sorts of jobs at all sorts of skill levels across a raft of sectors, including academia, tourism, healthcare, information technology, and engineering, just to name a handful. It has been very straightforward for these people to come here and provide this great contribution. It has also been unbureaucratic and critical and crucially, until former Prime Minister David Cameron's ill-judged decision to hold a referendum on EU membership, people from elsewhere in the bloc found a stable and certain environment in the UK. Now, not so. That is not the case. The Tory Brexit stance has already seen many people from other EU countries move from the UK to elsewhere in the single market, where there is more certainty and greater tolerance, and people in other EU countries who might have come to the UK, but had it not been for the Brexit vote, have not done so. This applies to people who would have had enough points under the new system and those who would not. The plunge in net immigration from other EU countries since the Brexit vote will have already cost the UK economically greatly, and there will be much worse to come when the reality of Brexit manifests itself with the end of the transition period. Meanwhile, the righteous anger of those who believe that they are among those being dismissed as cheap labour is entirely justified. Take, for example, those working in the care or the broader health sector. Those people are doing very demanding jobs and are crucial to society, and we should bear in mind that these jobs are far more valuable to society than many higher paid posts. So, yeah, I completely agree. We've seen this before. This idea of, quote, cheap labour. Many people who are Brexiteers who voted for this fall into this category of cheap labour. Beware, as I've said, they're categorising it as currently going after immigrants. And it'd be interesting to see if they start to introduce policy that goes after and, shall we say, weakens worker protections for these, quote, cheap labourers. And this is how it starts. Unfortunately, we are going to see there's no way Brexit ends up anyway near good. No way. We are looking at probably, I think, the worst case scenario for Brexit. I don't think that's hyperbole to say that anymore. I think the writing is very clearly on the wall. The Tories want to, well, they want to go full disaster capitalism, because you've seen this, ironically, in third world countries. You see companies, corporations destabilize a government, and it goes absolute hell in a handbasket, and then they swoop in, buy up all the assets as cheap as they can, and there you go. Now imagine you do this to a first world country. How expensive would the assets be if Brexit hadn't happened? Of course, you get post-Brexit a massive, probably economic crash coming. You know, there is going to be a lot of stuff happen to this country which nobody voted for. Nobody voted for any of this, and I think this is the crucial thing. I am really, I struggle to find a lot of sympathy for Brexit voters. I really do. But I think we're going to have to just swallow and just start extending our sympathy to these people, because these people were conned on a massive level. We all know, we've all seen it, all the areas that voted for Brexit heavily are going to be the ones most impacted. And these are the message we have to take for them. This isn't the Brexit you voted for. This isn't the Brexit anyone voted for. Brexit isn't working.